In the last course section, we got started with working with data and a database, and especially, of course, with models, with this models feature Django offers to us. And that worked all great. We were able to get started with models, and we could use models to insert data into the database, to update and delete it. And we could also use models to, of course, query the data and get the data. But up to this point, a lot of our work happened in this interactive shell. Whenever we added or updated our data, we went to the shell to work with our model there. And whilst this, of course, is something we can do as the site owner, it's not really convenient. It's not really the way we would like to edit our data. In addition, if you later deploy your site and you run it in production on a server, you might not want to connect to that server to interact with your data there with some shell. You would probably rather have some graphical user interface for working with your data. And of course, we could build something like this. After all, we already built a page that lists our data. We were able to query individual pieces of data. Of course, we could also try to build a user interface that allows us to add data. And indeed, later in the course, we are going to learn how we can work with forms and user input. But when it comes to managing this main data of our application here, we actually don't have to build our own user interface, because Django has a built-in admin feature, a built-in administration user interface which already exists, which you can leverage and use, and which allows you to administer your data. And that is a great backend for you, the site owner, to administer your key data. For example, your books, which you want to have in your bookstore. And therefore, that's exactly what we're going to take a closer look at in this course section. So back in this project we worked on before, I shut down my dev server, but I can of course restart it with manage py run server, as we did it all the time throughout this course. And with that server up and running again, I want to go back to the source code and there to this project folder, bookstore. In there, if we have a look at urls py, we see something interesting. There is this admin path in URL patterns. And that's a path we already saw before in the course. I didn't comment it much because we didn't need it up to this point, but now I want to take a closer look at that. What happens if we visit this admin path? Now, what happens when we enter /admin on our running page here? We should get a login field, a login form like this here. And of course, we didn't build this. Instead, this is built into Django. This already exists in Django. This is provided by Django. And where is this coming from? Well, obviously from this admin URL, but in the end, this admin URL is then pointing at admin.site.urls. And that is coming from the django.contrib module. And overall, this is all coming from one installed app, this Django contrib admin app. This is one of the built-in features, one of the built-in apps Django ships with, which gives us some pre-built functionality. In this case, for example, this user interface. So it would be nice to log in there to see where we can get, but how do we log in? What's our username? What's our password? Well, there's one thing I want to emphasize before we go ahead and log in here. This administration interface here really is not meant for the end users of your site, not for your visitors, but for you as the site owner to administer the content that makes up your site. If your site then also has some user-generated content, like orders in an online store, that of course would not be something you mainly administer through the interface we're about to load. But if you're building a blog and you have blog posts, if you build a shop and you have products, that's the type of content you want to administer through this interface. But that brings us back to the question how we can log in here. Well, since this is for you as the site owner, you as the site owner need to create a super user here, which in the end then can log in. And initially, such a user does not exist, but we can now easily create one. For this, you just need to quit that running server and then run python manage py create super user. That's another built-in command this manage py file gives you. You then get prompted to pick a username, and I'll just use Max here, or admin. Maybe admin is not a great name for security reasons, so I'll go for Max. And then enter some email address here, and I'll just enter a dummy email address. And then also a password. You're not seeing it here as you type, it's still being registered. So enter your password, hit enter, and confirm it, and hit enter again. And you see, I actually picked a password which was too similar to the email address and which was not long enough. But I can still tell Django that I want to take this password. And I'll do this here, since this is only in the scope of this tutorial and of this development here. But if you deploy your site and the admin functionality is also deployed, because you want to manage the data on the live website, you of course want to pick a secure password. Now I'll go with my less secure password here, and now this super user was created. Now that it is created, we can restart this server with run server, go back to the admin page here, and then log in with those credentials I just created. And once we log in, we should be greeted by a screen that looks like this. Here, you can, for example, administer your users. And if you click on users, you see all the users you got. And at the moment, that's just one user, which is this super user I created. But you could click on add user here to add a new user with a new username and password and so on. Now, this is all something we haven't built. This interface is not coming from us. This is an interface provided by Django. And that's also one of the very cool features Django offers, that it gives us such an interface to administer our data. But speaking of our data, where is our data? Where are the books which we want to manage? Well, we need to make Django administration aware of the data that should be managed here. Because not necessarily all your models need to be manageable here. If some content is user generated and you as an admin might not need to moderate it or view it, then you might not want to include it here. So therefore, you explicitly have to inform Django about which data should show up here. So to make Django aware that certain data should be manageable through this administration interface, we need to go back to our code and change something there. In our app folder, so in the book outlet folder, there you might have noticed this admin py file. And in the past, we didn't use that file at all. Well, now we will use it to register our models here for this admin interface. Therefore, we need to import our models. So from .models, I'll import book in my case here, since that's the only model we have. And then we can use admin, which is already being imported, .site.register, and then to register pass your model name. So in this case, book. And this tells Django that this model should be added to the administration site, that you want to administer it through that interface. So if we now save everything, if I go back and reload this admin page, now you see the books showing up here and the app name showing up here as well. And now we can click on books to start working on our data. And here we see the existing books. The text you see here is defined by this stir method which we overrode. So here I'm outputting title and rating, which is why that's how the data is presented here in the list. And we can click on a book to edit it, for example, and change the rating of my story to 3 if we want to, and maybe make it a bestseller. and click Save. We can also add a new book now with this Add Book button and add a new book where we say new story. The rating is definitely a 4. The author is me. And this is not a bestseller yet. And for the slug, we could now set our own slug, but we know that the slug will be auto-generated anyways because we overrode that save method. And hence here, I can click Save. And now we have a problem. Now I have to fill out that field here because it technically is required, even though we as the developer know that the value will be set automatically. So how can we now work around that? I mean, of course, we can enter some dummy data and save that, and then it would be saved, but that would be kind of bad because we entered some dummy data just to have it overwritten anyways. And that's not really intuitive and doesn't make a lot of sense. So what we need to do here is we need to customize how our data is presented here, how this form is generated, and which kind of inputs are expected from Django's side. So I want to make sure that I, for example, can submit this form without a slug being entered. Currently that doesn't work, but it should work because we know that the slug is set automatically anyways. Now, there are various ways of tweaking this. One way of ensuring that we can submit it empty is to go to our slug field and there add blank and set this to true, which basically means this can be submitted in a blank state and it could also be empty in a database, though we as a developer know that this will never happen because we always will set it before it's being saved. But besides the fact that it could be blank in the database, which doesn't matter to us here because we set it anyways, blank true also has an implication for the admin side. There it basically tells Django that this field, when it's rendered in a form as it's here, that this field may be empty. So Django will not make this field required as it does otherwise. So if I save that with blank equal to true, I now can try saving this again, and now it works with an empty field. And we can test this again. If I have new story 3 with a rating of 1, and I submit this, this now works because of our change where we set blank equal to true. An alternative would have been to go to the slug field and set editable to false. This tells Django that in the admin field, this field shouldn't be editable at all. And that might make a lot of sense because since we auto-populate the field anyways, we don't care about what the user entered, so it makes a lot of sense to not make that field editable at all. So with editable equal to false, if I now go back into a story, this field doesn't even show up here because it's not editable. So these are a couple of things to tweak here. So now this field doesn't show up at all here because it's not a field we should edit or change anyways. But maybe we do want to show it as a non-editable field and we want to have it pre-populated with the automatically generated slug. So that whilst we're filling out that data here, we already see the slug that's about to be added. And for that, we can customize our administration area beyond adding more and more arguments here. Because those arguments on the slug field are mostly there to configure the settings for the database and to a certain extent to also configure it for the admin area. But if you want to control more about the admin area than just some basics, there is a different way of doing that. You can configure how fields are being displayed in the admin form directly on the fields when you add them to a model, with things like editable equal to false. But if you need to do more advanced configuration, if you want to configure the overall form and which fields show up, and that maybe some fields should be pre-populated, then there is a different way of doing that. For that, you go to the admin py file, where you registered your book, and then in there, you can actually also create a new class. You can add a new class, which you typically give your model name, book, followed by admin with an uppercase A. This is not a must-use name, but a strong recommendation. Then this class should extend admin.modelAdmin. And this is now a class which allows you to set various options through properties and fields which you add to this class, which then will be reflected in the admin page. Now, to make Django aware of your book admin class, which should configure administration for the book model, you pass it as a second argument to register. There you point at book admin, like this. And then for the moment, I'll just add pass here to avoid errors. With that, if I save it, nothing changes here. But now we can use this book admin class to set various settings, to override various properties in this class, which then will affect how this class is presented in the admin form and how it can be configured. For example, there you can add a read-only fields property, and you should get auto-completion by the IDE, which is quite convenient. And read-only fields takes a tuple where you simply list all the fields that should be read-only. And field here really means a field defined in your model. So if you want to make the slug read-only, you add slug here to this tuple. And also add a comma here to make it a tuple, of course. If you save that and you reload, now you see the slug is back. It's still not editable because editable is false and it's part of read-only fields, and the latter would suffice actually. We could now go to models and remove editable false. And with that removed, if I reload, it's still read-only because we added it to that read-only fields tuple. Now here you see it has the slug, it shows the slug which was auto-generated. But if I add a new book, I would like to see a preview here, so that if I add new story 4, I see a preview of the slug that will be generated. And that's another thing we can configure through that book admin class now. There you can add the pre-populated fields value. And that takes a dictionary where the key holds the field name that should be pre-populated. So in this case, slug again. And again, that has to be a field name from your model. So I'll go with slug. And then as a value for that field, you have a tuple listing all the fields that should be used for pre-populating this field. And in my case, I want to pre-populate the slug based on title, because that's what I'm also doing here in save. I'm slugifying the title. So here I'll then add title, the title field name. And you always add those field names as strings here because you just want to give Django the name of the field that should be used. And add a comma to turn this into a valid tuple. Now, how does Django know how to pre-populate this field? Well, it has a look at the field type, and if that is slug field, as it is in the case of slug, it will simply call slugify under the hood. Now, if I save this and I reload this page here, I get an error. Key slug not found in book form. Choices are author, is bestselling, rating, and title. Now, what's the problem here? The problem is that slug is also added as a read-only field, which means it can't be edited. For pre-populated fields to work, you need to remove it from the read-only fields, and then reload, and then the slug is back, and now you see it gets filled out automatically as I enter a title. Now we could still change this if we want to, but I'm still overriding it anyways once we save. Though you could of course now consider removing this line here in the save method and getting rid of the overwritten save method altogether therefore, since it doesn't do anything else than this line here, because we're now pre-populating it in the form anyways, and therefore we might be fine with sticking with that pre-populated value. And we might want to allow the user to override this anyways, because of course sometimes the auto-generated slug might not be what we want, and giving the user the possibility to override this to a value that better suits his or her needs might be nice to have. You also don't have to worry that the user might then enter something invalid like this, which would not be a valid slug, because if you try to save this, you get a validation error. Because this Django admin form has this built-in validation, which we saw before already, based on your model. It has a look at your model field types and adds appropriate validation rules. Of course, also taking validators like this into account. So this admin interface really has got you covered and gives you a lot of flexibility. And therefore, I will go ahead and remove this save method, since we really don't need it anymore now that this is being pre-populated, and gives me a chance of securely editing this to a valid value. Now, if you search for Django admin, you'll find this Django admin site article from the official docs, which is a super long article listing all the configuration options you have. Now, of course, that's a bit too much to go through for this course, because I don't want to turn this course into me reading out this reference for 2 hours. But of course, feel free to dive into this reference if you are building a bigger Django project and you have certain aspects which you want to fine-tune here. With help of this model class here, this admin class here, which I showed to you, you have rich options of configuring this admin site exactly as you need to. And with the official docs here, you can find all the options and all the things you can tweak here. Now, there are more features we're going to explore throughout this course, but of course, that can definitely be a great resource in addition to really get a thorough overview and a thorough idea of what you can do. At the same time, this can be overwhelming, and in a lot of projects, you probably won't need to fine-tune anything, or only a couple of things, because this default look and this default behavior you got here is very often everything you need. Because this admin interface already makes a lot of smart choices, and therefore very often you don't need to tweak it at all, and hence you shouldn't feel overwhelmed by this documentation. It just lists all the options. That doesn't mean that you need to use all the options, of course. Now, one configuration option which I do want to show you here is related to setting filters. For this, we go back to our book admin class, and there you have the list filter key, the list filter property which you can add. This, as so many options, wants a tuple where you list all the fields by which you want to be able to filter when all the books are being listed. And this only refers to the books because we're in the book admin class, which is dealing with the book model as it's being registered here. So now we can have a look at the book model and see which of the fields here would be good fields to filter our books. If we had a longer list of books here, we might want to filter. And I think rating could make a lot of sense here. Maybe we also want to filter by author. So therefore, if you want to make this list filterable by author and by rating, you can go back to your admin class here, and then in list filter, you simply add author and rating as fields to this tuple. And of course, again, you use the field names as they are defined in the model. So here we have rating and author as field names, and hence these are the names we have to use here. And with that, if you save this and reload this page where all the books are listed, you see that now we have those filters which we can set and clear on the right. And that's again added automatically by Django. It is again just that we need to enable this through this configuration. Maybe we also want to change the columns which are showing up here so that it's not just book and shows us the string presentation, but instead that we have the title and then the author as two columns which display our data here. To set this, to add such columns, you again go back to this admin class here, and there you can add the list display tuple. And there you now list the field names that should be used as columns here in this list of data. So if we want to have the title and the author here, we would add title and author in that order. And if you now save this and reload this page with all the books, you see that instead of having that string representation of a book which we had before, now we have the title and the author data showing up here. And of course, that all still works with filtering. So these are a few examples of how you can adjust this admin page here. And of course, you could also work with more than one model and you can tweak more things. Now, we're going to see more than one model later in the course, in the next section already actually. And of course, we're also going to work with this admin section again. For the moment, this is everything I wanted to show you here because, as I said, the defaults are quite nice, and hence I would say it's time to move on and now actually dive into relations.